Something is unfolding quietly behind all this silence right now. And if you've been feeling it lately, it's not just your imagination creating patterns. There is a firm inner conclusion beginning to form inside their hidden emotional world, and your presence is deeply embedded in that process in a way they can no longer easily dismiss or push aside. On the surface, they may still look composed and unchanged. They might continue acting normal, even slightly distant or emotionally neutral at times, as if nothing is happening within them. But beneath that calm exterior, something far more significant is shifting. A truth they once avoided is now becoming too strong, too persistent, and too heavy to keep suppressing. It keeps returning no matter how much they try to move away from it. If you've been feeling like someone is quietly reaching a decision about you, stay connected with these words. There is more meaning here than what appears on the surface. What they are currently facing is not minor or temporary. It is not a passing thought that will disappear after a few days. It is a deeply important turning point in their inner life, one that has the potential to redirect the path ahead for them. They are standing at the edge of an internal realization that could reshape how they see themselves, their choices, and even their emotional future. Whether this leads them closer to you or further away, they will not come out of this moment unchanged. Something inside them is already transforming. You need to understand this clearly. The tension you've been sensing has a real foundation. The emotional distance between you is not empty, and the silence between you is not meaningless. There is something active within it, something unspoken but very present. Behind the scenes, an internal struggle is reaching its peak, and it is revealing parts of their deeper self they normally keep hidden. What you are feeling is not wishful thinking. It is not something you created out of longing. It is the natural echo of a connection that has reached deeper layers of their emotional identity, layers they cannot easily shut down or ignore. At this moment, they are standing at a crossroads where every direction they consider somehow leads back to you in thought, memory, or emotion. For a long time, they tried to manage this inner pull by focusing on distractions like work, daily routines, personal pride, or emotional distance. They attempted to convince themselves that time and space would naturally reduce what they were feeling. But certain connections do not fade in the way they expect. Instead, the more they tried to suppress it, the more it resurfaced with greater intensity. What exists between you was never superficial. It reached something real within them, something tied to identity and emotional truth, not just passing attraction. Now something unexpected is happening inside them. They are reviewing everything that took place between you. Not only the events themselves, but also what this connection says about them, their patterns, their fears, and their emotional growth. It is no longer just about you in isolation. It has become about what this bond reveals about who they are when they are forced to be honest with themselves. This is where a shift begins. Something is changing in the emotional atmosphere between you, even if nothing is being spoken aloud. When a person starts questioning the narrative they built to protect themselves, change is already in motion. That is exactly what is happening here. The decision they are wrestling with is not simply about staying connected or walking away. It goes much deeper than that. It touches the part of them that must decide whether they are ready to face their own truth without avoidance, without emotional defense, and without the masks they usually rely on. That is the real fear underneath everything. One part of them feels a strong, undeniable pull toward you. It is not logical or carefully calculated. It is emotional, instinctive, and deeply rooted. It feels like something they cannot fully silence, no matter how hard they try. Your absence does not feel neutral to them. It feels like something important is missing, something unresolved, something their mind keeps circling back to, even in moments of distraction. At the same time, another part of them resists this pull with equal force, because to fully acknowledge what they feel would require vulnerability. It would require emotional exposure, honesty, and the willingness to stop hiding behind strength or control. That kind of openness can feel threatening for someone who has built protective layers over time. It would mean breaking old patterns. It would mean letting go of familiar emotional defenses that once made them feel safe. It would also mean confronting parts of themselves they may not yet be ready to face. That is why everything feels heavier now. That is why the silence feels louder. That is why the connection, even without communication, feels more intense than before. Inside them, the conflict is no longer avoidable. They are not just running from the truth anymore. They are beginning to sit with it, even if reluctantly. Questions are forming in their mind more frequently now. Why do you still stay in their thoughts so often? Why does your presence return in quiet moments? Why has no one else managed to replace the emotional imprint you left behind? This is a threshold moment for them, a stage just before clarity begins to break through. The mind can only resist itself for so long before it reaches a point where a decision becomes unavoidable. Eventually, one perspective has to take the lead. As this pressure builds, the emotional mask they usually rely on begins to weaken. Small cracks appear in their internal defenses. The carefully controlled version of themselves they show to the world starts to feel less stable from within. Stay with this process, because what unfolds next will reveal whether fear continues to guide them or whether truth finally starts to take priority in their emotional world. If they move toward you again, it will not be because everything suddenly became easy or comfortable. It will be because they finally recognize the depth and rarity of what was shared. Some connections do not come repeatedly in life, and when that realization fully lands, it changes how a person sees everything. If they step away, it will not mean you were lacking in value or meaning. It will not erase the emotional depth that existed. It will only reflect their own readiness or lack of readiness to engage with the level of honesty and emotional responsibility that this connection requires. And this is why your position right now is not to chase, force, or control outcomes. It is to allow clarity to develop naturally. Let time do what it needs to do within their inner world. Some realizations only become clear when pressure is removed and space is given. What is happening inside them is not a small emotional fluctuation. It is a full internal conflict demanding attention. On one side is emotional pull, memory, connection, and a sense of belonging tied to you. On the other side is fear, past disappointment, and protective conditioning that tells them to stay guarded and avoid emotional risk. These two forces are in direct opposition, and the intensity of that clash is growing harder to ignore. Even if they try to distract themselves through routines, work, or daily responsibilities, the inner dialogue does not fully stop. Something keeps pulling their attention back into the same emotional space where you exist. And over time, that kind of inner pressure becomes impossible to completely suppress. They may act as if none of this internal conflict really affects them at all, maintaining a calm exterior that hides everything underneath. But the more they try to suppress what they feel, the more those emotions refuse to stay buried and keep rising back up, demanding to be acknowledged. If you've been noticing their push and pull behavior, their warm moments followed by sudden distance, it reflects that inner contradiction more than anything happening between you on the outside. The real struggle has never been external. It has always been happening within their own mind and heart, quietly but intensely from the very beginning. That is also why whatever they decide next carries far more weight than it may currently appear to have. You became a meaningful turning point in their emotional and personal development, even if neither of you fully realized the depth of it at first. When this connection began, it disturbed the inner defenses they had carefully built over time to protect themselves from emotional discomfort and past wounds. It reached the part of them that exists beyond image, beyond control, and beyond the identity they present to the world. Now they are standing in front of a real and difficult inner decision. One path allows them to stay within the familiar version of themselves, the one shaped by comfort, predictability, and emotional safety. The other path pushes them toward a newer version of themselves, one that requires openness, emotional honesty, and the courage to take risks they may not be used to. This internal conflict is draining them more than they expected. It shows up in the inconsistent way they respond to you, the moments of closeness followed by sudden withdrawal, the times they seem emotionally present and then disappear again. This cycle is not always about games or intentional distance. In many cases, it is what happens when someone deeply feels a connection, but is also afraid of what fully accepting it would require them to become. As this pressure builds inside them, old illusions they once relied on begin to break down. They can no longer easily tell themselves that you were insignificant or just a temporary part of their life story. Instead, clarity is slowly forcing its way in, not only about your role in their life, but also about their own emotional patterns, their fears, and the truths they have avoided facing for a long time. Even the quiet between you is no longer empty. It carries meaning now. The absence, the silence, and the distance are all becoming part of their awareness in a way they cannot easily ignore. This is why their thoughts keep circling back to you, especially in moments when everything else is still. If you've stepped back, that space has played a significant role in what they are experiencing. Without constant access to your presence, they are left alone with their own thoughts, and that silence becomes a mirror they cannot avoid. It reflects back everything they were previously able to distract themselves from. The emotional impact of your absence, the sense of loss, and the absence of connection become more noticeable when nothing is filling that space. And when someone finally begins to feel the true weight of absence, they stop questioning whether it mattered. Instead, they start questioning why they didn't recognize its value sooner. In their private thoughts, comparisons begin to form naturally, even without intention. What they felt with you starts to stand out in contrast to everything else. Not because of perfection, but because of emotional depth and authenticity. This is not about idealizing a person or a connection. It is about the way you made them feel something real within themselves, something that awakened a part of them that had been quiet for a long time. That is why this process feels so internally transformative for them. They are slowly being guided toward a decision they can no longer delay. They cannot continue existing in a state where they are emotionally divided. Something within them is pushing toward resolution. Either they remain within their familiar emotional patterns, avoiding discomfort and change, or they move toward growth, honesty, and emotional responsibility that this connection has been quietly demanding from them. At this point, fear and desire are no longer separated inside them. They are directly facing each other. One side pulls them toward emotional truth, connection, and vulnerability. The other side pulls them back toward safety, control, and emotional protection, shaped by past experiences and old wounds. That fear does not necessarily come from you. It is often rooted in earlier emotional pain, disappointment, or situations where vulnerability led to hurt. And yet, despite that fear, the pull toward emotional truth is becoming harder for them to ignore. This is why their behavior continues to shift. In one moment, they feel drawn toward openness and connection, imagining what it would mean to stop resisting what they feel. In the next moment, fear returns and pulls them back into hesitation and doubt. Both sides feel completely real to them, which is what makes this inner conflict so intense and difficult to resolve quickly. Their longing feels real and deeply rooted, while their fear feels just as real, acting like a shield they believe they need for emotional safety. So they remain suspended somewhere in between, not because they don't care, but because they are trying to steady themselves inside an internal storm that feels overwhelming at times. Yet no one can stay in that kind of emotional turbulence forever without eventually reaching a point where something has to give. A moment always comes when the inner pressure becomes too strong to keep balancing both sides. At that point, one force begins to lead more clearly than the other. Either fear continues to keep them at a distance, or their deeper emotional truth starts guiding them towards something unfamiliar but honest. And what they are facing is not just a simple question about a bond or a relationship. It is also about identity, about who they are becoming through this experience and what kind of person they choose to step into from here onward. That moment of decision feels closer now than they may openly admit to themselves. Until recently, they were stuck in a loop of hesitation, going over the same thoughts repeatedly, analyzing memories, reinterpreting signs, and trying to apply logic to something that is far more emotional than rational. But feelings with this level of depth cannot stay unanswered forever. Eventually, clarity demands to be met. As that inner pressure builds, their behavior may seem more distant or unsettled from the outside. But distance in this context should not be misunderstood as absence or closure. Sometimes withdrawal is not an ending, but the final stage before a truth can no longer be delayed. It is often the moment just before internal acceptance breaks through. They are also beginning to realize how exhausting it is to stay in this middle state. Living neither fully connected nor fully detached drains emotional energy and creates a constant loop of inner conflict. It keeps them stuck without real direction, and over time, that lack of movement becomes its own form of discomfort. Now there is a growing sense of responsibility forming within them. Responsibility for what they feel, what they have avoided, and what they have not yet expressed. That requires honesty, and honesty removes the safety nets they have leaned on for a long time. They are being forced to ask themselves whether they are truly willing to risk the comfort of their current emotional structure for something that requires vulnerability and growth. This situation is starting to feel irreversible in their inner world. The period of maybe is slowly collapsing into something more defined. Deep down, they are beginning to recognize that this connection was never just a temporary emotional experience. It became a meaningful point in their personal evolution, something that exposed both their feelings and their inner limitations. What once looked like protection now starts to feel like restriction. The hesitation that once felt wise now feels like something that is keeping them stuck in place. Because avoiding the decision never actually removed the emotional tension, it only delayed it. And in that delay, the pressure has continued to build quietly in the background. They are now noticing the gap between what they feel internally and how they have been acting outwardly. Moments they stayed silent when they wanted to speak. Times they pulled away while actually wanting to come closer. Instances where pride took the place of honesty. These realizations are not comfortable for them, but they are becoming impossible to ignore. This awareness is slowly changing how they see everything. As that internal gap begins to close, change stops being optional and starts becoming necessary. They can no longer fully escape what they already know within themselves. For a long time, logic was used as their main defense mechanism. Distance became protection. Silence became avoidance. Distraction became a way to postpone emotional truth. But feelings that are deeply rooted do not disappear through avoidance. They resurface whenever life becomes quiet enough for honesty to be heard again. Now, in those quieter moments, thoughts of you return naturally, not because they are forced, but because something within them remains unresolved. Your presence is still present in their inner world in a way they cannot easily switch off or replace. And this is gradually shifting how they interpret the entire connection. What once felt uncertain or confusing is now being seen with more emotional clarity. They are starting to understand that this was never only about missing another person, but also about missing a version of themselves that only seemed to surface in this connection. A more open, more honest, more emotionally aware version. That realization changes the nature of the question entirely. It is no longer just about whether this bond mattered, but whether they are ready to act on what it revealed about them. Even while they continue with daily life, responsibilities, and distractions, something inside keeps pulling them back toward this emotional truth. And slowly, the protective part of them that relied on distance is losing its control over the situation. When they weigh it internally, the idea of a safe but emotionally empty path begins to feel less tolerable than the uncertainty of something real. This shift does not happen loudly. It happens quietly, as emotional clarity replaces confusion. They begin to see where fear influenced their reactions, where avoidance shaped their decisions, where emotional protection prevented honesty. And with that understanding, their perspective starts to reorganize itself. As they revisit memories with a more mature emotional awareness, they also begin to understand your side more clearly than before. This awareness naturally creates reflection, and reflection creates responsibility. They are no longer just observing the situation from a distance. They are becoming aware of their own role within it. And that awareness changes everything internally, because it moves them from passive confusion into active self-examination. At this stage, old patterns like maybe later or not now begin to lose their strength. They are replaced by a quieter but stronger inner pressure that asks for clarity. Staying emotionally frozen starts to feel more painful than making a decision. Even though fear is still present, it is no longer the only voice they are hearing. Alongside it is a growing recognition of emotional truth, and that truth is becoming harder to ignore with each passing moment. Your presence, even in silence, acted like a mirror that revealed parts of them they had not fully acknowledged before. And now, even in your absence, that reflection continues to influence how they think, feel, and evaluate their own choices. So the question is no longer whether this connection affected them. The question now is when they will stop resisting what they already understand internally. Everything is gradually moving toward a point of clarity. The confusion is thinning out, and what remains is something more grounded and real. And when they finally act, it will not come from pressure or confusion, but from recognition of truth. Everything is gradually moving toward a point of clarity inside them. The confusion that once filled their mind is starting to lose its grip. Not because the situation has become easier, but because they can no longer ignore what they already feel deep within themselves. What remains now is something more grounded, more honest, and far harder to dismiss. And when they finally act, it will not come from pressure, impulse, or emotional confusion, but from a quiet recognition of truth that has been forming over time. They are beginning to understand that what they are experiencing is not something that can be neatly controlled or logically organized. For a long time, they tried to treat it that way. They tried to analyze it, delay it, minimize it, or place it into categories that felt safer. But emotional reality does not stay contained in logic for long when it carries depth. It expands, it returns, and it reshapes the way a person sees themselves when they are alone with their thoughts. This is why even in moments where everything seems normal on the outside, something inside them continues to move. It is subtle but constant, a quiet awareness that refuses to fully disappear. And the more they try to act unaffected, the more they are confronted by what they are actually feeling underneath the surface. They are also starting to realize that avoidance has not given them peace. It only gave temporary distance from discomfort. But that discomfort never truly left. It waited. It resurfaced in silence, in stillness, in unexpected emotional moments that they could not fully control. And now it is becoming clear to them that what they were calling protection was also creating emotional stagnation. Because staying in emotional suspension always comes with a cost. It creates internal fatigue. It drains clarity. It keeps a person mentally split between what they feel and what they allow themselves to act on. And over time, that split becomes too heavy to maintain. That is exactly the state they are moving out of now, even if they are not fully conscious of it yet. There is also a deeper layer unfolding within them, something tied not just to emotion, but to identity. This connection did not only bring feelings to the surface, it also reflected parts of them they had not fully acknowledged before. The version of themselves that feels more open, more emotionally alive, more willing to be real without overthinking every step. And at the same time, it exposed the parts of them that rely heavily on control, emotional distance, and self-protection. So what they are facing is not only about choosing a direction toward or away from a person. It is about choosing between two internal versions of themselves. One that remains within familiar emotional patterns, and another that steps into vulnerability, uncertainty, and emotional growth. And that is why the process feels so intense for them, because either direction requires change. Staying the same no longer feels neutral. Even inaction now feels like a decision of its own. They may still appear composed or emotionally distant at times, but internally, the weight of this situation is becoming harder to carry without acknowledgement. There are moments when silence no longer feels peaceful to them. Instead, it feels reflective. It brings everything back into focus. Thoughts return. Memories return. Emotions return. Not as chaos, but as quiet reminders of something unresolved. And in those moments, your presence becomes more noticeable again in their inner world. Not because something new is happening externally, but because the noise that used to distract them is no longer as effective as it once was. When distractions fade, clarity becomes unavoidable. They are beginning to understand that what they experienced with you was not random or insignificant in their emotional journey. It created a kind of internal imprint that does not simply fade with time. Instead, it resurfaces when they are honest enough to sit with themselves without distraction.